If you want to get started with Dolby Atmos, there are three distinctively different approaches that you could take. First of all, you could go with a digital audio workstation that has a natively integrated Dolby Atmos workflow. At the time I'm recording this were Cubase, Nuendo, Logic, Pro Tools, DaVinci Resolve Fairlight, and Pyramix from Merging Technologies. If I missed one, let me know in the comment section. The second option would be to go with Fiedler Audio's Dolby Atmos Composer, which is an interesting one because it can be used on Windows as well as on Mac on pretty much any digital audio workstation. And the third one would be to use the Dolby Atmos Renderer, the external Dolby Atmos Renderer. This is the option that you will most likely find in a professional Dolby Atmos mixing studio. Now, I did a number of different videos on all three of these approaches, but I've never actually compared them. So what we're going to do today is we're going to look at a project and we're going to convert that into a Dolby Atmos project using the three different approaches. And then we're going to look at those and kind of see what works, what doesn't work, what is good, what is bad, and what might be the best way for you to go if you want to start with Dolby Atmos. So let's get started. But first of all, hello everybody. In case you're new here, my name is Michael Wagner. I'm a digital media educator with more than 30 years of experience in higher education. And on this channel, I talk about digital media, game design, and spatial audio. And today about three different approaches to Dolby Atmos. If any of those topics interest you, I invite you to subscribe or join our Discord community. Invite link is in the description below, or there's also a QR code here somewhere. But before I get started, I would really like to hear from you what your thoughts are about Dolby Atmos. Is this something that you're interested in getting into? Is this something that you're already doing? If you're already doing it, what software are you using? Leave your comments in the comment section below. It really helps me kind of figuring out what the next videos are that I'm going to do. And with that being said, let's get into our project. The way I'm going to approach this video today is a little bit different to what I normally do. I usually like to go through each individual step in the setup process so that you can follow along in case you want to. However, this would have been way too long for the video today. So what I decided to do instead is use one project, and I've already converted that into Dolby Atmos using the three different approaches. And I'm going to show you the outcomes, and then we're going to discuss what the things are that I had to do in order to achieve those outcomes. Now, the digital audio workstation that I'm going to use today is Cubase. The reason I'm using Cubase is because it's one of those DAWs that allows me to use actually all of the different options that I have, and I can really show you the differences. However, everything that I'm going to say works for pretty much any digital audio workstation. There are some limitations, and wherever there is a limitation, I'm going to talk about that. I'm also going to work on a Mac today. That has a reason because one of those options is only available on the Mac operating system. But let's first have a listen what we have here. Now, this is a project that I already used in one of my previous videos, and I'm actually going to come back to that. So let's get that started here. So this is a very simple loop consisting of 4 samples, well actually 3 samples and 1 MIDI loop. What we have here is we have one drum loop. That's actually an instance of Groove Agent, and what I've done is I've prepared that to become the Dolby Atmos pad. So this is routed into a 7.1.2 track that will essentially become the Dolby Atmos pad, and on this group track I have an instance of cinematic rooms, essentially to give it a little bit more space and also to make sure that I have information on all individual channels of the Dolby Atmos pad. Now, as I said in some of my previous videos, there are no rules on how you specify what becomes a pad and what becomes an object track. So this is primarily for demonstration purposes. You would probably not choose a drum track to become the pad, but once again, just for demonstration. Then we have another drum loop. So this is this squeaky thingy that's going to become an object. Then we have a second drum loop, which is sort of a bongo. And then we have a synth loop. And these three loops come from a sample pack from a producer that I really like. I'm going to leave a link in the description below. He produces sample packs that are designed for game audio, music and TV productions. And they're really nice. Not a sponsored video, I just like what they do. Once again, link in the description below. So let's first have a look at how the project turns out if you're using the workflow that is internal to Cubase. Now, if you're using a different audio workstation, then this will look a little bit different. If you're working with Logic, it's going to look different. If you're using Fairlight, it's going to look different and so forth. However, the main principles are always the same. The digital audio workstation needs to route 2 different types of streams into something that essentially renders the Dolby Atmos master file. And these 2 different types of streams are on one hand the audio streams that are coming from the 128 audio channels. Those can be object channels or bad channels. And that's something people usually forget, it also needs to take care of the metadata streams, and those are coming from the object panners. So those contain the positional information of all the objects and size and things like that. And if you're using an internal workflow, that's something that you don't really have to worry about. We will see later that if you're using other workflows, we sometimes actually need to handle them separately. But in an internal workflow, and that's actually one of the nice things, everything is already taken care for you, and you don't have to kind of worry about those things. Now in Cubase, how do I do that? Well, first of all, I need to create a 7.1.4 track that holds the Dolby Atmos renderer. That can be an output bus. I usually use a group track for that purpose, but the recommended option is to use an output bus, but for whatever reason I'm going to use a group track here. And on this group track, which once again is a 7.1.4 track, I have an instance of the Dolby Atmos renderer. And then the second thing I need to do is I need to tell Cubase what are the objects, what are the bad channels, and how do I route them into the Dolby Atmos renderer. And this is done by going into the project settings under ADM authoring for Dolby Atmos. And here I have to make a couple of settings. First of all, I have to tell Cubase what renderer I'm going to use. Now, if you're working with Cubase, you only have one option, and that is the internal renderer. So select that. And then you need to add the bed, which is a 7.1.4 track usually. And then you can add additional objects, and Cubase will essentially make sure that everything is routed correctly. So let's have a listen on what we have here. And the way I've done that in all the examples that I'm going to use here, I'm just down mixing everything to stereo. So let's just kind of set that down mix to stereo in order to essentially have some consistency across the different projects that I'm going to use. So let's play that audio now. Open the render again, and I see sort of all the individual bed channels. Those are 10 bed channels once again, and then I have the 3 stereo pairs that are essentially kind of Cubase automatically routed into those individual objects. So what do I have to do if I want to add an additional object? Now that's actually very straightforward. So let's just do that. So let's add an audio track, and I'm going to keep that empty. It's just for demonstration purposes. So let's call it test. Let's add that, and let's move that up so that it gets into view. And the only thing I really need to do is I need to make sure that it is routed into the Dolby Atmos renderer. And this is done by going into the project settings under, once again, ADM authoring for Dolby Atmos, and we're going to add one object, and then we have to select the source track. Now, the way I've done that here, the track that I currently kind of added is not really showing up, and the reason it's not showing up because here we will only see the tracks that already have the panner on the track that is necessary in order to be identified as a Dolby Atmos object. If you're using the Dolby Atmos renderer on an output bus, this will be done automatically because the panner will kind of adjust to the output bus. But because my output bus is essentially a stereo track, I need to do that manually. So let's go into the... Actually, let me just kind of close that window completely. Let's go into the settings here. And the easiest way to really do that is just by routing the track into the Atmos bus. And as soon as I'm routing the track into the Atmos bus, I have the panner. And if I now go back into the ADM authoring for Dolby Atmos settings and I go into the input settings, I now see this test track and I can select that, and it will automatically generate the object IDs and identify which tracks everything is routed into, and everything is set up at that point. And that's really everything you need to do. So this is really straightforward. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of doing it that way? Well, first of all, this is really easy to set up. Everything is consistent with the workflow that you're already used to. So if you're working in Logic, everything kind of feels natural. If you're working in Cubase, everything feels natural. So you don't have to worry too much about all the routing that is going on in the background. The disadvantages are that this approach is somewhat feature limited, and how feature limited it is depends on the digital audio workstation. So for example, a couple of things that you can't do. You're limited to 7.1.4, so if you have higher speaker configurations, that's something that you can't do here. There's no option to export what's called a quality control deliverable, which is an MP4 in a very special encoding format that is generally used in order to test your Dolby Atmos master file on different consumer devices. And there's also no speaker calibration. That's something that is important if you are going the professional route, for example, and you want to get Dolby certified. So there are certain limitations, but in general, if you're kind of just playing around with it and you already have a digital audio workstation that has this type of workflow, this is a very, very easy way to get into Dolby Atmos. So let's check out how the same project looks if we're converting it into Dolby Atmos using the Fiedler Audio Dolby Atmos Composer. Now the first thing is it looks fairly similar. The main principles are the same. The first thing that we need to do is we also need to generate a 7.1.4 output track, or in my case I use the group track for that purpose. The only difference now is that instead of having an instance of the Dolby Atmos Renderer, I have an instance of the Fiedler Audio Dolby Atmos Composer. Now, there are a couple of advantages of using the Composer, and I did a video about that. I'm going to leave a link in the description below. One of the main advantages is that the Fiedler Audio Composer, Dolby Atmos Composer, is not limited to 7.1.2 beds. They have a concept that they call composites, which is actually a very smart way of extending the capabilities of Dolby Atmos to higher bed channel configurations. Then there are also options to address a speaker layout that you might have in your studio, even if your digital audio workstation is not capable of handling this type of speaker layout. So for example, you can use the Dolby Atmos Composer from Fiedler Audio in order to address or to kind of work with a 7.1.4 speaker layout in your studio, even though the Dolby Atmos Composer is on a digital audio workstation that might only be stereo. And the way this is done is by essentially using a separate external output from the Dolby Atmos Composer, thereby circumventing the actual output from the digital audio workstation that you're working with. And the final advantage obviously is, and that's something that I've already said at the very beginning, that it works for pretty much any digital audio workstation on Windows as well as Mac. So it might actually be your only option to do that. Now, there's actually one additional thing that needs to be done, and currently this is a little bit hidden, and the reason for that is because I need to kind of scroll down here. Each individual track now needs to also have an instance of the Dolby Atmos Beam plugin. And the Dolby Atmos Beam plugin takes care of all the communication between the track and the Dolby Atmos Composer. So when I said at the beginning that there are two different types of streams, an audio stream and an object stream, or a metadata stream, this Beam plugin beams both simultaneously. So it streams the audio as well as the metadata into the Dolby Atmos Composer in one go, so to say. That has a couple of advantages, but it has one disadvantage, and that is that if you put that Beam plugin onto the track, then at the moment, essentially the audio reaches that Beam plugin, it is then beamed into the Dolby Atmos Composer, and that means that in general, the fader does no longer really work. That's something that a lot of people have complained about. The reason simply is because the audio never reaches that. However, Cubase is nice in the sense that it has this option, and this is the reason why everything is down here. So let me just kind of scroll that up here again. Cubase is nice that it has this so-called post-fader insert. So if you put the Beam plugin on a post-fader insert, it will actually go through the fader first and will then essentially be beamed on the Dolby Atmos Composer. So the quality of this workflow depends a lot whether or not your digital audio workstation has the capabilities of working with post-fader inserts. Cubase does that. So this is actually a surprisingly nice kind of way of working with Dolby Atmos and Cubase in particular. So let's add an additional Dolby Atmos object track here as well. So I'm going to do the same thing again. Add one audio track, call it test, keep it empty, move it up here. And the only thing I really need to do is I need to add an instance of the Beam plugin to that track. So let me just kind of scroll down here. And I'm going to once again use a post-fader insert. Going to add a Beam plugin and the Dolby Atmos Beam plugin, and that's all I'm going to do. I need to select what exactly I'm using this track for. Is it going to be a composite or is it going to be an object? I'm going to choose object for that purpose, and that is really it. And if I'm now adding, or if I'm now opening the Dolby Atmos Composer, let me scroll back up here again. I see the additional test already coming in. It is identified as an object. It's coming in at channel 17 and 18. Everything is set up. So this is actually also really, really easy to set up, and everything kind of works pretty much out of the box. And once again, one of the really nice things is it works for Windows as well as Mac on any digital audio workstation. So let's play the audio and let's just check if everything works the way it's supposed to. I haven't done that yet, so let me just play that here. And as you can see, I'm getting everything in exactly the way I'm supposed to. And this is actually a really nice option. The Dolby Atmos Composer is a really, really, really nice alternative to the traditional Dolby Atmos workflow, mainly because, once again, it can work on Windows as well as Mac on any digital audio workstation. Now, having said that, a lot of people are coming across an issue And that is that at this point, when they're starting to play everything through the Dolby Atmos Composer, you get crackles and dropouts, and it sounds a little bit like your CPU is hitting your limits, and a lot of people have complained about that. And the first thought is that this means that the Dolby Atmos Composer requires a lot of resources, but that's actually not really the case. What is happening here is that the Dolby Atmos Composer is bypassing the entire routing system that is internal to your digital audio workstation. So if your digital audio workstation does any optimization in the background when it comes to mixing the individual tracks, that can conflict with the Dolby Atmos Composer. And one of the causes for those issues generally is multi-threading. So if you have a digital audio workstation that makes extensive use of multi-threading during the mixing process, that can cause issues, that can sound like audio dropouts. If that happens to you, you need to find the settings in your digital audio workstation to disable multi-threading. In Cubase, for example, this is under Studio Settings. If you go into Studio Setup, and here you have this one box, Activate Multiprocessing, that is turned on by default. Depending on how you set up, that will cause issues. I generally just turned it off, and once you turned it off, everything works just fine. So this is one thing to be aware of. Multi-threading can be an issue. I've tried it on different digital audio workstations. I had to turn it off on FL Studio. I had to turn it off in Reaper, and I also had to turn it off in Cubase, to be perfectly honest, in order for it to work. But once you've essentially kind of turned it off, everything just works fine. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of doing it that way? Well, first of all, the Dolby Atmos Composer from Fiedler Audio works in any digital audio workstation, which is really nice, Windows as well as Mac. Very cool. It has this additional option of composites, which are essentially Atmos bed tracks with higher channel counts that Dolby Atmos usually allows, which is also really nice. It kind of does a bit of trickery in the background and kind of turns certain speakers into objects in order to make that work. Really, really cool. It allows you to address higher channel configurations in your studio. So if you're working in a studio that has a 7.1.4, 9.1.6 or whatever speaker layout, but your digital audio workstation is only stereo, you can actually address your speakers from a stereo digital audio workstation, which is also really, really cool. And then it can also play the master files that you create. So if you're creating a Dolby Atmos master file, one of the issues usually is that you can't really play that in a regular media player because it is a very special file. The Dolby Atmos Composer has the ability to load in master files and can be used as a player, which is also really, really cool. I showed that in my review of the Dolby Atmos Composer. I'm going to leave a link to that video in the description below. Now, the negatives, well, first of all, I find the panning device to be a little bit unintuitive, to be perfectly honest. The usability is not as nice as some of the other solutions. The workflow is a little problematic if you don't have post-fader inserts, which are, quite frankly, most of the digital audio workstations. So you need to deal with the fact that as soon as you put a beam plugin on your track, the fader is no longer working. One way to work around that is to use buses for that purpose. That's one way you could do. But in general, it makes things a little bit more I wouldn't say unusable, but less usable, let's call it that way. But it works really nice if you have post-fader inserts. So in Cubase, for example, it actually works great. And then there are a couple of technical issues that come from the fact that the Fiedler Audio Dolby Atmos Composer is circumventing the entire internal routing in your digital audio workstation. So there are certain instances where you need to disable multi-threading, for example. So it's always a good idea to first test everything if it works in your setup. If it works, it's really, really great, but it can have a couple of technical issues depending on the digital audio workstation that you're using and the system essentially in general that you're using. So next, let's have a look at how the project turns out if we are using the external Dolby Atmos Renderer with Cubase. Now, this project is exactly the project that I developed in last week's video. So if you want to know exactly how we did everything, I'm going to leave a link in the description below. Watch last week's video. Here, I'm just going to go through the basic result that we got. One thing to remember is that the external Dolby Atmos Renderer is only available for Mac, at least in the functionality or with the functionality that we need. There are certain items or certain plugins that we need that are not available for Windows. So what I'm going to say now only applies to Mac operating systems. So if you're on Windows, unfortunately, this is not an option for you. Now, The setup is a little bit different, and the setup is a little bit more involved, to be perfectly honest. So the first thing that you need to have is you need to have two applications open simultaneously, obviously. So you need to have the external Dolby Atmos Renderer open. And in the Dolby Atmos Renderer, you need to go into the preferences and you need to make sure that the input device is the Dolby Audio Bridge. And this is actually one of the things that is not available on Windows. The output device obviously is whatever your studio output is. And then in Cubase, there are a couple of things we need to do actually. We are not going to go through the ADM for our authoring settings because we're not going to make use of those. But what we need to do is we need to go into the studio settings. And the first thing that we need to do is we need to make sure that the output device, the ESIO driver that you're using, is the audio bridge. And that will make sure that the audio channels are routed from the Dolby Atmos, from Cubase into the Dolby Atmos Composer. So this is sort of taking care of the audio portion of the Dolby Atmos setup. Then we need to also make sure that we have the appropriate outputs that will essentially route the individual objects and the bed tracks into the Dolby Atmos Composer. And this is done by going into the audio connection settings. And in the audio connection settings, you need to create outputs for each individual object and each individual bed. So we have one essentially output for the Dolby Atmos bed, which was a 7.1.2 track, and we made sure that we routed into the channels 1 to 10. And then we had the three objects, object 1, object 2, object 3, and we routed them into channels 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. And then one additional thing that we need to do is we also need to communicate the time code with the Dolby Atmos renderer. And this is done with a separate output track that is a mono track that routes into the Dolby Audio Bridge at channel number 129. And this additional output track holds an instance of the timecode plugin. So let me just go in here. So here essentially you see the timecode plugin on this additional track, and that essentially communicates the timecode from Cubase into the Dolby Atmos renderer. Now this takes care of the portion that is concerned with the audio. So all the audio channels are now routed into the Dolby Atmos Composer, but we have not yet taken care of the metadata. And that is routed with the help of the Dolby Atmos Music Panner. So on each of the object tracks, not on the bed track, because the bed track is actually just routed. There is no additional metadata that is routed. It's just kind of the audio that is routed into the renderer. But for each object, we need to have an instance of the Dolby Atmos music panning plugin. And in the Dolby Atmos music panning plugin, we need to first tell the system where the Dolby Atmos renderer is located. In my particular case, it's on the same machine. So I'm going through it through the localhost system or through the localhost address. That's the correct way to kind of put it. We need to also tell it what audio tracks this metadata belongs to. So we need to kind of tell it that this is the audio object with, that essentially is the object with audio tracks 11 and 12. And we need to do that for each individual object. So let me just close that here. And, kind of do the same thing for all the other objects here with 13, 14, and so forth. And that is essentially everything that we need to do. Be aware that if you set it up like that, you need to do all the panning with the Dolby Atmos Music Panner. So if you're actually using the panner that is on the track itself, you will actually screw up the image of your audio, because the panning in the Dolby Atmos project is actually done through the music panner and not through the audio panner on your track. So one thing that you might want to do if you work with that, in order to make sure that you don't really kind of do any mistakes by accident. You could, for example, disable all the panners here. So you can go in here and just kind of disable them, for example, right? But this is one thing to consider. Now, once we have done that, we should be able to hear everything. Now, once again, I'm down mixing to 2.0 to stereo. So let's just play everything. And I'm getting all the audio information. I'm getting the timecode information and everything. Now, why would you want to kind of go through all this trouble? Well, there are a couple of reasons, really. First of all, it is the professional solution. So if you're working in a professional environment, that's really the way you need to go, because you probably need to get Dolby certified, and this is the only way to really kind of get that certification. There are a couple of advantages. For higher speaker layouts, for example, you can go into the room setup and you can have higher speaker configurations. That is really cool. And then most importantly, you can also do speaker calibrations. So you can essentially calibrate each individual speaker, which is usually required if you get Dolby certified. So there are a couple of really important reasons why you want to go that route, especially if you are aiming for a professional kind of use of Dolby Atmos in your studio environment. So let's do the same thing that we did with the other ones. Let's see what we get or how we actually add an object. And here we need to do a little bit more than usual. So let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to once again add an audio track, and I'm going to call that test again, and I'm going to, it doesn't actually make any difference because we need to create a separate output for that anyway, so let's add the track. The second thing is we need to add the appropriate output. So let's go into the studio settings under audio connections and let's add a bus, and this is going to be a stereo bus, and this stereo bus, let's call that test as well. We're going to add that. Then we need to, sorry for that. I forgot to route everything. So this stereo bus needs to be routed into channels 17, the next available ones. And for whatever reason, it sometimes screws up those numbers. So when you add a kind of a bus, make sure that they are kind of ordered correctly. We actually don't want to have 17 and 19. We want to have 17 and 18. And then that we need to route the object that we created. This was this test track. And we need to route that into that particular output. So this was this test output here. And then finally, we also need to make sure that the essentially the metadata is routed. So we're going to add a music panner, Dolby Atmos music panner here. And in the music panner, we make sure that the network is set correctly. And then we need to select the object pair, which in our case was 17 and 18. And that should take care of everything. And if we go into the panel now, I now see that 17 and 18 sort of have been identified as objects, and everything should just work fine. So if you're working with this solution, there's a little bit more that you need to do in order to set everything up. But there's actually one additional option. If you go Nuendo, Nuendo actually has an internal workflow for the external renderer, which is really cool. So let's have a look at how the same thing works in Nuendo, because this is actually kind of really interesting. So here we have the same project converted into Nuendo, and what we have done here is we have used the internal workflow with the external renderer. So how does this work? Well, first of all, if you go into the project settings in Nuendo, you can go down to the ADM authoring for Dolby Atmos, and here you actually have the option to choose the external Dolby Atmos renderer. By choosing that, the advantage is that you can use some of the functionality that is internal to Nuendo in order to communicate with the external Dolby Atmos renderer, and that is in particular kind of that portion that is taking care of the metadata, really. So kind of you can use the internal panners in order to communicate the metadata with the Dolby Atmos renderer. Now the Dolby Atmos renderer setup is identical to what we did before. So we also have to go into the preferences. We have to select the Dolby Audio Bridge as the input device, and then essentially whatever output device you're having. And then essentially we need to tell Cubase, we need to tell Nuendo how to map the outputs to the individual objects. And that is done by going into the renderer setup. And in the renderer setup, a couple of things once again. We first of all need to tell the system where that renderer is on the network. That is actually not done by default, so you need to put that in. So make sure that you don't forget to kind of select here. You can either choose the IP address or you can just kind of type in localhost. And then we need to map the individual output devices to the renderer input device ports in order to be able, so that Nuendo knows which panner goes to what object. And you can simply say map all, and that will map all 128 tracks to the renderer. Now, once we've done that, we can work with the external, we can work with the ADM authoring for Dolby Atmos in the very same way we would actually work with the internal Dolby Atmos workflow. That essentially means that we can simply add objects and it will do it pretty much in exactly the same way. The one thing I would recommend if you go that route is to select that option here, Auto Connect Object Buses, because we will need, in the very same way we worked with Cubase, to have separate output buses for each individual object that is routed into the Dolby Atmos Renderer. And you can either do that manually in the exactly same way we did that in Cubase, or you can have Nuendo do that for you. And that essentially is done if you select it. I'm going to come back to that in a second. But before I do that, I want to add one more thing, and that is while some of the functionality is now taken over by internal processes within Nuendo, there's one thing we still need to do, and that is we still need to add an LTC, a timecode bus. So in the same way we did that with Cubase, we need to go into the audio connections. We need to go into the audio connections and we need to add a monobus that holds the LTC plugin, and that is going to be routed into output number 129. And on this output, we then have to, let me just kind of do that like that. We need to add a timecode plugin here in exactly the same way we did it with Cubase. So this is something that you actually need to do in Nuendo as well. But with that being said, everything else should actually work fine. So let me just play the audio if we're actually getting audio, if I actually done everything. And as you can see, it does it in exactly the same way. Now, the one thing that Nuendo did for whatever reason, and I'm honestly not quite sure why, it mapped the objects starting at object number 16 for whatever reason. I don't know. It does it automatically. So how do we go about if we want to add an additional object? So let's do that here as well. So the first thing that I'm going to do again is I'm going to add an audio track. I'm going to call it test. And in the very same way we worked with the internal Dolby Atmos renderer in Cubase, in order to be able to actually, for Nuendo to identify that as an object track, it needs to be routed into a multi-channel track so that the correct panner is already on that track. And the easiest way to do that is simply when you create the audio track, should just select the audio bed or the bus. It doesn't really make any difference, and let's just add that. And that will make sure that the panning device is already the correct one. And then all we really need to do is we need to go into the project settings under ADM authoring for Dolby Atmos. And we just need to add an object. We are going to select Auto Connect Object Buses. That means that it's going to create an additional output bus for us. So let's add one object, and let's make that a little larger here. And the input that we're going to choose is the test track. And as soon as it does this, you see that it has created an additional output bus automatically and added that to our output, and that is already routed into the Dolby Atmos renderer. And because we are using the internal workflow, we can actually work with the built-in panning device in Nuendo. So this is also a really nice way to go about creating Dolby Atmos. It's a little bit more streamlined, a little bit more easier to kind of do than kind of working with the external renderer in Cubase. But there's still a couple of things that you need to think about. And most importantly, don't forget to put a timecode plugin into your project, because that is actually something that it needs. Now, one thing that I should also mention is that you can also use the external renderer on a separate machine. So you can set up a dedicated machine that does the rendering and have the digital audio workstation on another machine. That is actually the traditional Dolby Atmos workflow. However, that is a little bit more complicated to set up and quite frankly also a little bit more expensive to set up, because what we have done within your machine or within our system, where we had the 128 audio channels and we routed them from the digital audio workstation into the Dolby Atmos renderer, we now need to do through hardware. So we essentially need to have 128 audio channels going out of the computer that runs the digital audio workstation, and then essentially have these 120 audio channels go into the other workstation that holds the Dolby Atmos renderer, and that requires quite sophisticated audio interface setups where you essentially move from one computer to the other. So this has been done in the past in professional studios. Not quite sure if they still do that, because these days computers are usually fast enough to just run everything on the same system. You don't really need to have those systems separated anymore. But this is an option if you want to kind of be very, very fancy and kind of do something that essentially people have done for a long time. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of doing it that way? Well, first of all, if you are in a professional environment, this is probably the way you need to go, because that is what you need to do in order to get Dolby certified. It allows you to access higher channel configurations. It allows you to create quality control deliverables. It allows you to do speaker calibrations in your system. And it's just kind of the more complete kind of way of really kind of going about Dolby Atmos. The disadvantages is it is more complicated to set up. There are a couple of steps that you need to do. And most importantly, it only works for Mac operating systems, because once again, some of the things that we needed to use, in particular the Dolby Audio Bridge and the Music Panel, are only available for Mac operating systems. If you want to kind of use this setup with a two-computer setup where you have a dedicated rendering machine, that's an entire different story altogether, because then essentially you have a very, very complex hardware setup on top of everything. So in summary, what's the best way to go into Dolby Atmos? Well, the answer is it really depends. If you are a professional working in Dolby Atmos or aiming to work in Dolby Atmos, there's really only one option, and that is through the external Dolby Atmos renderer. If you are somebody who is really dedicated to the digital audio workstation and doesn't really want to kind of switch over to a digital audio workstation that has a natively integrated Dolby Atmos workflow, then there are really two options that you have. You can either do the external Dolby Atmos renderer if you're on a Mac. If you're on Windows, then the Fiedler Audio Dolby Atmos Composer is your only option. And for everybody who is on a digital audio workstation that already has a internal Dolby Atmos workflow, the best way is probably just to use that particular workflow. There's no advantage of kind of going into a different or kind of using a different approach. So it really depends on your situation. Once again, if you're on Windows, the Fiedler Audio Composer is your only option. If you are kind of aiming for a professional studio environment, then the external renderer is your only option, and everything else sits somewhere in between. And it depends a lot on essentially what your personal preferences are. So this is really everything I wanted to say today. Thanks again for watching my videos. I really appreciate it. If you have any questions or comments, please use the comment section below or join our Discord community. Invite link is in the description below. As I said at the very beginning, I would be particularly interested to learn about your thoughts about Dolby Atmos and what you're currently using, in case you're already working with Dolby Atmos. Please leave your comments in the comment section below. But with that being said, see you at the next video.